one. Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. I've had many, many, many illustrious guests, but few have engendered as much excitement as this next gentleman because I think we are both geeks in our disposition. We both love books. Tom Ayling is a antiquarian bookseller. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you very much for having me, Dr. Saad. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, and please feel free to call me Gad if you'd like. Although I appreciate the proper etiquette, which we'd expect nothing less of a properly educated Brit. Okay, so I thought what we'd do is start with just your journey, right? I mean, you look pretty young. How does a young chap such as yourself become this glorious antiquarian bookseller?
Well, that's very generous of you to put it that way. Um, the sort of big moment for me, I was very fortunate, happened when I was quite young. I was 10 years old, and one of my favorite authors came to visit our school to talk to us. And then afterwards in the school library, she agreed to do a book signing. So I had very eagerly brought along a great pile of books for her to sign. And for me, like for everyone growing up, books are just vessels for stories. They are texts. And for the most part, what we get out of them are the stories that they tell us. And so I hadn't noticed that in my pile of books, six of them were paperbacks and one of them was a hardback, for example. And she very patiently went through my pile of books, signing them for me. And she got to the final one, the hardback on the bottom, and she said, "Oh, this one's a first edition." And I'd never heard that word before,
How old
but
were
something
you?
about the cadence of it sounded very special to me.
How old were you at that point? Sorry to interrupt.
I was 10.
Okay, go on. Sorry to interrupt.
And then the next thing she said was incredible. She said, "Because it's a first edition, there's a mistake in it that I need to correct for you." So she signed the book for me, inscribed it in Latin, of course, and then she turned towards the end of the book and with her pen corrected this typo and handed the book back to me. And that object I received back was genuinely transformative. It was a different object to the one I gave her in the first place. And perhaps as a competitive 10-year-old, it also had the quality of making it feel much more special than any of my classmates. And that was the real starter for me that books were historical artifacts. They could be things greater than just the texts that they hold. And it's been a long, slippery slope into bibliomania ever since.
Well, as you can see here, and I think I mentioned this when I invited you on the show, Tsundoku, which I didn't know that term until a fan sent it to me, which refers to sort of the obsessive collecting of books. Okay, so you're 10 years old, you have this transformative moment, but then there is a big gap until you say, hey, 10 years ago or however long ago it was, I'm going into this business. Did you study? I mean, were you an English lit major or a history major or, a book scholar or not at all?
No, not at all. I didn't study it. It's not, I mean, this aspect of dealing with books, book history, treating books as historical artifacts and the trade of antiquarian bookselling, there's not really a direct university program for it. I was in the social sciences at university. I studied international relations and became incredibly frustrated with it. Um, and I had initially wanted to go into academia, but thankfully, while I was at university, I was working in a bookshop and decided that ultimately I didn't want to leave a bookshop and I wanted to work in one for the rest of my life. And so after I graduated, I left the thoughts of academia behind and got a job as a trainee antiquarian bookseller at a bookshop close to where my then girlfriend, now wife, lived.
Wow. Well, of course, the antiquarian booksellers market gain is academia's loss. Always, as an academic, I hate when I hear that someone decided not to go into academia, but I can appreciate the romance of what you do now. So then, how do you, I mean, I've often, when I play the game with my family, if I had $1 billion, what would I do? And it invariably turns into I would basically become Tom Ayling. Uh, but although I wouldn't do it to sell them, I would do it to hoard them in my beautiful
Yes.
mansion. Uh, how did you go about I mean, so let's talk a bit about the economics of it, and then we'll come
Mm.
back to the romance of it. How do you even enter such a market? Do you start with uh, cheaper books so that you can build the collection and then move on to The Hobbit, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll talk initially about what to do if you're a collector, and that's,
Sure,
what you want to go about, and then we can perhaps get into the kind of business
sure.
side, which is related but separate. Um, the truth is, when you're collecting books, you can buy really incredible material on any budget. So the first old book that I bought, knowing it was old and special, didn't cost me very much. I think it cost me £2 or £3 in a secondhand bookshop, and it was a copy of Rudyard Kipling's poetry in a beautiful leather binding, and that was an incredibly special object for me to have, and I sort of coveted it for a slightly unexplicable reason. Um, but, people often look at the rare book market and they'll see that a copy of, The Hobbit has just sold for £50,000, or a first edition of Frankenstein sold for $1 million, and think that book collecting isn't for them. But there are many, many copies of, be it The Hobbit or Frankenstein or any book of your choosing, in the world that survive in both interesting editions that are less expensive than that and more affordable, but also at the level of the individual copy can be incredibly interesting because of, say, who owned it or annotated it, or what's happened to that book in the course of its life after its publication. So sometimes having the kind of budgetary constraint of not having $1 billion and just buying whatever you want makes it more fun, because you have to think more laterally and think more creatively, and perhaps look at books that you wouldn't give the time of day to otherwise if you were this sort of, billionaire book collector who could just buy first editions of every book they wanted.
Can I engage in what I consider to be a flex, but it may not impress the antiquarian bookseller? Because to your point about operating within your means, although I don't know how much it cost because it was a gift given to me by my family last year for my birthday. Are you ready, Tom?
Oh, please.
First edition.
Oh, wonderful.
You
Yes.
ready? Hold on, one more. I'll do one more. One more. The big one.
Yes.
Uh,
Oh, marvelous. Yes.
Impressive or not much for an expert such as yourself?
No, no, no. They're absolutely wonderful, wonderful things. I mean, there's something incredibly transporting in holding in your hands a first edition of a book, because you're seeing that as sort of the unexploded tinderbox, especially with two books like the ones you've just shown, 1984 and Animal Farm. When you think of the impact that they had on the world, to think of them existing before they had that impact, before they'd even been read. And you can hold in your hands when you're holding a first edition. In those cases, they're the first American editions, but they're published at the same time as the books in the UK. You're getting the very same experience of reading Animal Farm or 1984 as that book's first readers had, which is that unique privilege of reading a book before it was famous.
Yeah.
Animal Farm, I think, or no, it's 1984, I think, is when the British public were polled at the book they lie most about having read when they actually hadn't. 1984
Is
came
that
top.
right?
Yes. So so perhaps in that case it's especially, significant. But also it doesn't just get you closer to that book's earliest readers, you're getting closer to the author themselves. I mean, writing 1984, which was published in 1949, killed Orwell. He shouldn't have been up in Jura with poor heating writing the book. He should have been resting and recovering. And the process of actually finishing the manuscript of that scholars now think is, led directly to his untimely death. So you are right there in the same universe as a great book's creator when you're holding a first edition.
You know, again, not to overly compliment you, but in all the years that I've had wonderful conversations, you might be the first one to have actually given me goosebumps as I heard your passion about these books. And actually, frankly, that's how I decided to reach out to you because I had seen you. I love the fact that you do all this outreach to get people to love books through your YouTube channel, through your Instagram. And I was watching you, and usually when you go to your Instagram, if the algorithm picks up that you're interested in something. So now you're constantly in my feed and I'm just sitting there consuming Tom Ayling. And so I love that because one of the things that I hear when, let's say, I'm lecturing or something is that, my passion for whatever subject I'm teaching comes out, and it certainly comes out of each of your pores. I wanted to show you another one, which is the Holy Grail for me, and then I'll ask you to tell me what is the Holy Grail for you. Regrettably, it is not a first edition, Tom. Can you, without me showing you what it is, it looks as though it could be a first edition. You have no idea what this is, of course. Not enough information. You're
Not yet.
not yet. You ready? Can you read this?
Oh, yes, marvelous.
So this
Yes.
is a 1975 Franklin edition. Now I went to Raptus Rare Books. I don't know if you know them. I mean, do
Yeah.
you know? You do? Okay.
Yeah, in Palm Beach. Yeah.
In Palm Beach, exactly on Worth Street. And I actually got the incredible honor of holding a first edition of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Not wishing to put you on the spot, but do you know what it was priced at?
I know what I would price it at. I mean,
Okay, go.
I mean, if you have it in, it depends on the copy and the condition of it, but a sort of a decent copy in the original cloth binding in nice condition, maybe £250,000, $350,000.
Wow, that's almost exactly right. It was priced at $400,000.
Yeah.
I mean,
Nice.
literally almost exactly right. Now, maybe we could talk about this and we can oscillate from the romance of book collecting to the business of book collecting. But what are the key factors that go into pricing a rare book?
Mm. I mean, what lots of people are looking for when they're buying a first edition of a book is getting as close to the point of origin as possible. After all, that's why we want the first edition and
Right.
not the 18th or 130th. So if that book was published in, say, the 20th century, then you'd be looking for a copy that is, in nice condition. It's still got its dust jacket. It looks the same as it did the day it was published. And in that circumstance, you've got almost a kind of time capsule piece that is, as it was when it first entered the world. With a book like Darwin's Origin of Species, of course, published in the 19th century, you don't have books published in dust jackets. At the time of Origin of Species, you do get them later in the 19th century, but there you're looking for, the sort of summa would be a copy in the original cloth, still gleaming in that green and gold, in lovely condition. So originality is really, really important. But it is only one factor, and there are a multitude of things that can happen to a book in the decades or centuries after it was published that can make it more valuable and interesting. It might have been owned by somebody important or owned by several people who were important. Alfred Russel Wallace's copy of The Origin of Species would be interesting, as would David Attenborough's for that,
Right, right.
for that matter. And he does collect The Origin of Species, so that would make sense. But a copy that Darwin gave to somebody close to him, or even inscribed, would be kind of the pinnacle for a book like that. Sometimes it's fun to play a little game, and you think of a book from history, and you think, well, what is the best conceivable copy in the world of that book? Whether that's Great Gatsby inscribed by Scott for Zelda, or I guess Origin inscribed for Alfred Russel Wallace, or or any of those things, The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit inscribed for C.S. Lewis. Um,
Wow.
you know, um, but aside from those kind of famous examples, you can just have a copy that perhaps of a book that has been annotated very vigorously by an early reader. And then as we look through that copy, we are getting the sense of how people were responding to that book at the time and how that's changed. If you look at books that are 500 or 600 years old, some of which, I have behind me, these books have passed through many, many hands in the, half a millennium that they've taken to get to the present day. And so you can not just see the book at the time it was published, but all the different things that have happened to it since in those intervening centuries.
How you were mentioning sort of signed copies as being, of course, one of the markers of how expensive a book will be. On average, do we have a sense of how much added value a signature on a first edition brings?
It again, it all comes back down to rarity. So there's no hard and fast rule. Um, if it's an author who you literally can't stop them signing a book, it might add little or no value to it. But if it's a reclusive author, for example, then it can add untold value. A book like 1984, for example, is published right near the end of George Orwell's life, and only one inscribed copy has been offered for sale. It's the copy he inscribed to Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a British man of letters who was very close to Orwell in his final days. Attended his deathbed wedding to Sonia and visited him regularly in hospital. So, in an instance like that, where very, very few inscribed copies of that great work of literature are known, it can turn a you know £5,000, £10,000 book into a £250,000 book quite easily.
Wow. Is there a difference? I mean, both in your personal preference, but more generally economically, between fiction, fictional works versus non-fictional works in terms of how excited the antiquarian book collector or the bookseller will be?
I mean, the wonderful thing about our world is that it's not kind of one homogenous market of rare books, but it's made up of all these wonderful little microclimates that can be incredibly small, single author markets. So, the market for a Tolkien book and the Tolkien market is very different to the Orwell market, just like the market for, 19th century science books is different to 20th century psychology. So all these different things have, I suppose, they're in different places on the sliding scale as to what's important. Condition, for example, plays a far bigger role in value when it comes to particularly modern books, but certainly works of literature, than in general non-fiction. And that's in part because I think when you think of something like a dust jacket on a book in the 20th century, they can become so creatively central to our memory of the book that they're kind of really part of the book itself in a way that the dust jacket to a work of, say, science or mathematics or whatever, they're usually plainer. They might not even be decorated in any way. Certainly, the early jackets for those books are simply, printed titles on the covers and no pictorial element at all. So simply in terms of kind of attractiveness and appeal, as well as sort of the sense that they're forming part of it as a historical object, they can have different impacts on value.
In your pursuit of rare books, do you have a preference in terms of which of the ecosystems you'd like to navigate?
I mean, for me, what I'm interested in is books that have the most to tell us. And by that, I mean individual copies of individual books that reveal quite a lot to us about their time. So these are often not books that are, totemic or famous. A book like the Shakespeare First Folio, the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays, It's a rare book that most people interested in books have heard of. It's a very valuable book worth, 10 to $15 million, depending on the sort of condition it's in. It is also sometimes an incredibly boring book because many copies of it are just copies. You can read through it, but no one's annotated it. They haven't necessarily been owned by people throughout history. They don't always have a great sense of or a great amount of things to tell us about Shakespeare's day and 17th century theatre beyond the plays that they're reprinting for us. Whereas there are certain copies of less interesting or less famous books that have an outsized impact in terms of historical importance, if not monetary value. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the University of Rochester, there is a copy of Robert Burns's poems. It's an American edition printed in Philadelphia in the mid 19th century. And this is a book that you can buy copies of this edition of Burns's poems for 15, £20. It's not a valuable book. But the copy owned by the University of Rochester has an inscription in it. And the inscription, when you open it up, says, "This is the first book bought by me after my escape from slavery, and now I give it to my son,
Wow.
Frederick Douglass."
Wow. Oh, hold on a second. Hold on a second. I want to show you something. You say Frederick Douglass? Hold on. Boom.
There we are.
Wow. It's funny that you said University of Rochester because when I was finishing off my PhD and looking for, professorship, assistant professorships, one of the places that I was about to accept an offer was at the Simon School of Business at the University of Rochester. Okay, let's go back. You said I'm going to give you a couple of examples. That was an amazing one. Continue with some other ones if you have those.
Well, one of my favorites is, do you know Procopius's Secret History?
I don't.
Or so Procopius's Secret History is his history of the court of the Emperor Justinian. So Byzantine emperor, some people consider Justinian the final Roman emperor. And Procopius was the court historian. He was a man of court. And he wrote the official history of Justinian's reign. But he also wrote this other book that in the earliest records is called his Anecdota, and is later called his Secret History, which is kind of the truth about Justinian's reign that wasn't published in Procopius's own lifetime. And there was a good reason for that. It's incredibly, to say it's rude about the emperor is to understate it. He spreads all sorts of rumors about the emperor's wife being a child prostitute and them all engaging in group sex in the palace, and the emperor himself being the devil incarnate. So it's an incredibly incendiary work. And this is written in the mid 6th century and remains lost and unpublished for over 1,000 years until a Vatican librarian around the year 1620 called Niccolò Alemani rediscovers the manuscript of it in the Vatican Library. And I went to the Vatican Library to see that manuscript and the first edition of the book that was published in 1623 last summer. And it's incredibly interesting because as you're going through the printed edition of the book that's published in 1623, you discover that Alemanni took out all the juicy bits. So any reference to the Empress Theodora and what they were up to, or the incredibly scathing bits about Justinian, were not published when the book first came out in the 1620s. In part because Alemanni was a man of the Vatican. He didn't want to embroil himself or his position in the church in scandal. But the copy of the book in the Vatican Library is very, very interesting because somebody has added extra pages at each of these sections where Alemanni skips a bit. And they've handwritten in the 17th century, all those sex scandals and gossip and accusations that are left out of the published version. And that is one of the things that makes me so interested about this because printed books, by their nature, are objects that exist in multiples. They're naturally duplicated. But after 100, 200, 300, 400 years, no two copies of a book from the same print run are still the same object because people own them, people annotate them, they read them, they give them away, they lose them. All sorts of things can happen to them that means that when these objects arrive to us here in the 21st century, they're totally different. And in this case, with the first edition of The Secret History in the Vatican Library, you're getting a full sense of what someone in the 17th century had to do to pursue knowledge.
Wow, that's amazing. Uh, have you met any authors that in 100 or 200 years, some other instantiations of God Saad and Tom Ayling will be talking about? I mean, J.K. Rowling or something. Do you have these kinds of stories to share?
Um, it's impossible to say. I mean, when you look at the authors that are most famous or most collected today, they aren't the authors that people predicted 100 years ago. There was a very famous poll in the Guardian newspaper a little over 100 years ago. I think just after the First World War, where they asked their readers to predict which author writing today would be most read in 100 years' time. And you had rich pickings at the start of the 20th century. You could have had, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Evelyn Waugh, all these wonderful novelists. But the author that won by a landslide in that poll was John Galsworthy, who nobody reads now.
I don't
And
even know who that is.
no, exactly. And he wrote a novel called The Forsyte Saga, which is his most famous book. But if I owned a copy of the Forsyte Saga in first edition and had it on my shelf here, it would take me years or decades to sell it. So it's really really difficult to predict which authors are going to sort of rise above, rise and separate themselves from the pack, and which authors will be considered simply period pieces. Going back, in history, there are countless examples of this. People who were incredibly popular in their own day that don't have longevity. When you look at the playwrights of Shakespeare's day, Shakespeare occupies, the vast, vast majority of all theatre still performed today. But in the 17th century, he was split among, it was Shakespeare, it was Johnson, it was Beaumont, it was Fletcher. And it's very, very difficult to predict anyone alive today that will be read in 150 years' time. It might be that nobody publishing novels right now is going to be considered, a great writer after all of their contemporaries and perhaps the two generations that follow them are gone. I mean, someone like J.K. Rowling's an interesting example because her books are very, very valuable as first editions. First edition of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the first Harry Potter book, only 500 hardbacks of that first edition were printed. So it's printed in very, very small numbers. And that could set you back 100, 150,000 pounds if the book's in nice condition. And it's really too early to say what that book's going to be worth in, 50 or 100 years' time. It might be that the kind of cultural phenomenon of, remaking films and TV shows and reprinting the books and then passing from generation to generation will keep them alive. But equally, there aren't many children's books of the 19th century that we still read today, beyond great classics like Alice in Wonderland. So it's really, really difficult to make those sort of predictions.
Do you ever experience the tension between your business decision? I have a seller here for this book that's been sitting on my shelf for 3 years, but it's one of my absolute favorites in my collection, and I will not get rid of it. Do you ever feel that? Or ultimately, There is a price for any book, and no amount of romance is going to stop you from selling whatever you have in your collection.
Mm. Um, I do find myself lying awake at night thinking at books I've sold and desperately wanting to see them again. But I mean, I do have to confess, and this is absolutely true. I derive a huge amount of pleasure from seeing someone get as excited about a book or more than I have. So when you see someone light up when you present a book to them, that's incredibly gratifying to share that experience with people because these objects that I deal in are complex objects, and many people's eyes glaze over when you talk to them about it, or they don't understand exactly the complexity and intricacies of some of these items, whether from a sort of structural perspective or a bibliographic perspective or a historical perspective or an associative perspective. So when you find someone who really gets it, I'm very happy to let them share in that pleasure. And it's also the case that books do have a funny way of coming back to you one day. So
Wow.
um, just because you sell a book to someone, it doesn't mean you're not going to see it again.
It's actually a nice segue, you saying that, you get great pleasure in seeing someone's eyes light up, a book collector. Let's talk very briefly about the psychology of book collectors. To the extent, I mean, I think you've not done the academic study of it, but you could certainly anecdotally talk about it. So in some of my work, so I apply uh, evolutionary psychology to study human behavior in general and consumer behavior in particular. And so many forms of collecting might end up being forms of sexual signaling, right? So I collect cars because that's the way that I peacock, right? And therefore
Mm.
I want to show to the world. Tom might be able to afford a Mustang, but he can't afford my very rare Maserati. That's how we differentiate ourselves. But it seems to me, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, the book collector is seldom going to have as the driving motive the desire to be signaling to the world that I own a first edition of Origin of Species. There are many other forms of collecting where that motive might be operative, but there is something unique and somewhat sacred about book collecting. Is that true, or am I romanticizing it too much?
Well, I might be romanticizing it too, but I do agree with you. And, sometimes if I'm accused of being overly romantic, I do say, well, if you can't be romantic about old books, what can you be romantic about? But, um, but no, I agree. Book collecting is a very private passion. And that's in part to do with the uniqueness and singularity of every single object in that collection, but also the nature of a library. A library is a very, very personal thing. And you might walk into a grand manor house and see leather-bound books on the wall and think that's impressive. But actually, for the most part, those libraries aren't terribly impressive. They're just, leather-bound sets of an author's work. So they're not like fine art or sculpture or cars, these things that you can put on your wall and are immediate status signals. Something else drives it, and it's different for different people. Some people collect their favorite children's books from childhood as a way of holding on to that, that feeling of wonder. And then they're, these transitive objects for them. Some people collect in an incredibly kind of practical and scholarly way. Sometimes we're collecting first editions of books because they're the only edition you can get. So if you want that information, then you need to get the first edition or an early edition of it or a special edition of it because of, some informational factors that it shows. And some people just collect for that slightly indescribable love of the thing itself. And for me, I find that it can be quite hard to explain. And if I have to explain it too much to someone, it's just quite clear they're probably not going to get it. Um, but between bibliophiles, when we share this love of books, both for their text, but also for them as historical artifacts. There is this kind of unspoken understanding and fellowship, between us, and that's a really big factor for me, certainly.
How do you go about building your collection? Are you going largely to estate sales? Are people just contacting you? Hey, my Uncle Joe, who was a big bibliophile, has regrettably passed away. And are you, how does that work? Tell us the,
Yeah. I mean, I suppose there's two main things. I mean, sometimes it's very lucky and things come to you and fall on your lap, but more often than not, we're going out seeking these things out, and that's where you have that wonderful opportunity for discovery. I mean, I was on holiday last week in Norfolk on the east coast of England. I go every year with my wife's family, and there's this incredible little bookshop that is basically the downstairs rooms of somebody's terraced house. And there are probably 25, 30,000 books crammed into probably a floor space smaller than the one here, which houses about 500 books in this office. And I've been going to this shop for years, and I was turning the corner and I saw on the bottom shelf this book in a grey cloth binding, and it had the titles of four novels on the spine. Three of them I'd never heard of, but one of them I had, and it was Jane Eyre. And I opened it up and turned to Jane Eyre, and it transpired that this was the first American edition of Jane Eyre from 1848, just sat there in this
wow.
little bookshop in rural Norfolk. So you have experiences like that, which are wonderful, and you just find things in the most unexpected places. That's a book that you'd expect to find in the sort of wood paneled rooms of a New York City rare book dealer, and there it is tucked on the end of a shelf in somebody's house. But there's also cases where the the discovery happens after you've bought the book, and it starts to reveal its story to you as you research it. And they're certainly the most sort of gratifying and rewarding moments in this business. I'll share one quick example
Please.
with you, which was I bought at auction sight unseen last summer two books that were in cloth boxes, and they were book bindings of about 1910, 1912, 1913. And they were housed in these very plain cloth boxes that had been made at the time to protect them. And when I bought them, I didn't know what books were inside the boxes. I didn't know who the bookbinder was. I was just taking a punt, and the books arrived, and I opened them up, and inside these boxes were immaculately preserved. They'd probably not left the boxes for about 100 years. Fine leather book bindings. And when I see a fine book binding, the first thing I want to do is work out who made it. So I open the book up, and one of them is inscribed in ink on the title page, "To Nell from Arthur, 1913." And the other one is inscribed in the binding, "Nellie Fyson, her book, ex Dono AJG." So that's Nellie Fyson, her book, a gift from this person called AJG. And as I dug into these initials and the name Nellie Fyson and Arthur and Nell from the other book, I managed to find who they were. Eleanor Fyson grew up just outside of Cambridge and became a nurse around 1910. And that was appropriate because one of the books that was given to her and in this fine binding was The Life of Florence Nightingale.
Wow.
And the identity of the person who inscribed the book for her and the AJG who was mentioned in the inscription in the binding was someone called Arthur Gray, who was a bookbinder. And I discovered that they became engaged in 1913, and he worked for the family firm of bookbinders J.P. Gray and Son in Cambridge, who continued to make books, to bind books for the university well into the 20th century. And suddenly we've gone from having these two beautiful books to something really quite intimate. Books made by a bookbinder for his fiance. And I then made a further discovery that rather changed the whole taste of the entire thing, because in 1914, war breaks out, and Eleanor goes to Great Ormond Street Hospital, the children's hospital in London, and works as a nurse there during the war. And Arthur Gray joins the army and goes to the Western Front. And on the first day of fighting at the Battle of Passchendaele, 31st of July, he's killed in action.
Wow.
And suddenly, I mean, I remember just when I read that, just sitting there in silence for a matter of minutes, because these were for her really the last relics of him and his love for her. And the fact that you can uncover these layers of meaning, the objects are still the same
Right.
as when I opened them up, as when I left a bid on them at auction. They've not changed, but as you research the people involved in these books, the objects do genuinely transform, both in their meaning and our understanding of them as historical objects, and they can become these extraordinarily emotive things.
You- Finish your point.
And
You go ahead.
days like that where you can turn a book from just a fine binding and be able to share this extraordinary story of two people who loved each other, and the both the beauty and the loss. Those are days that feel like a reasonable day's work to me.
Wow. I mean, in a sense, the way you just described that story, it's part archaeology, part
Mm.
history, right? I mean, and I've often said to my wife when, she's getting annoyed at me because I want to go to another used bookstore, and I say, look, I'm an archaeologist of books. I mean, I mean, I could easily buy it on Amazon, right? Like,
Mm.
but I want to find, exactly to your earlier story, hidden behind a bunch of books, that cop, and it's not because I just saved $17, because I'm on an archaeological hunt, and then that dopamine hit that I get having found it doesn't come from any pecuniary concerns. It's not that, oh, I just saved $12. It's that I've gone on this journey. So having said all that, the way you speak, Tom, first, number one, I regret that you didn't go into academia, because I'm sure you would be an incredible professor to a lot of students who are otherwise saying, oh, this is so boring. Is there a way we can bottle Tom Ayling's passion in a bottle so that we could sprinkle it maybe on my teenage kids so that they could be more into reading books? Is there a way we can solve that conundrum?
I mean, the best way that you do it is by getting that experience for yourself.
Right.
So some corollary to that experience I had when I was 10, when I had someone sign a book for me, and I felt that moment that a book could transform in value sort of before your eyes. So yes, I mean, everyone listening to this should be out there every weekend in secondhand bookshops looking for books and feeling the joy of the tactile of the real thing. It's such a different and more pleasant way of, on one hand, consuming information, and on the other, the actual process of discovery and learning that you go through when you actually see these things and feel these things with with your own eyes. I mean, the one thing that ebooks can't replicate, and I use ebooks every day in my research, but the one thing they're not is 3D objects with a smell, and they engage all the senses. And there's this sense where you can, look at the cracks between the binding and see the old paper that's been used to fix the binding together, and all these other things that you can only get when you're dealing with the real thing. So people should get out to bookshops. They should visit book fairs. Lots of people now, unfortunately, don't have a local antiquarian bookseller that they can go to. But organizations in Canada, in the US, in the UK, across the world, trade associations of booksellers run secondhand and antiquarian book fairs. Um, I'm at one this weekend in Oxford, and at another one the weekend after in York, in northern England. And there you're going to a space where maybe 30, 50, maybe 100 or 200 people like me who sell old books bring books to share with everyone under one roof for a weekend. And you can take them down and look at them and have that feeling of holding a first edition or a very old copy of your favorite book in your hand. And if that doesn't get you the bug, then I'm not sure I can help you.
I was gonna say so. In my last book, it was a book on happiness, which is a daunting subject to write about because
I'm sure.
the ancient Greeks have already cornered that market on how to live a good life. And so, in one of the early chapters, I talk about occupational happiness and how can you find that. And of course, I talk about, purpose and meaning and so on. And I think you might be the exemplar of someone who is maximally occupationally happy. Would that be a correct statement?
I mean, I absolutely I adore what I do. I feel incredibly fortunate to be able to spend my life in books and talking to people about books and sharing my love of books with people. But of course, like everyone, what people see when I talk to you here or when I make videos online or when I write about books is only a very small part of me.
Yeah.
The part of me that is currently stressed because I'm behind on six different deadlines and I've got a full inbox of people I need to get back to and all that side of things. Um, make it a sort of, at times a stressful job like any other. But you can't compete with the opportunities that it provides for discovery. And that for me is the greatest pleasure in the world.
One or two more questions, and then I'll let you go to get back to your emails and so on. Will there ever be, so this is kind of a meta book question, will the antiquarian bookseller ever write a book himself? Because, by the way, as you're speaking, I almost feel you're sort of like, and again, I think I'm giving you too many compliments. You're kind of, maybe it's the accent, maybe it's the background, but I almost feel like I'm in a David Attenborough documentary, the way you speak. But instead of speaking about the great Kiskadi bird in Bermuda, you're talking about some great, work of fiction or some book. Uh, any chance, or are you thinking about ever writing a book yourself, Tom?
I'm writing one at the moment. I'm not allowed
Oh,
to say too much about it because my publishers haven't announced it yet. But a spring of 2027, it will be published. I'm working on the manuscript at the moment and I'm delivering it early next year. Um,
it will be about your life as a bookseller.
it's not autobiographical, but it's a history of the world told through rare books and our encounters with them, and this essence of books as historical artifacts that have more to share with us than simply the text they contain.
Will you send me a signed copy when it's out?
Oh, absolutely. It'd be my pleasure.
And please return. So, other than that project, are there any other things that you're currently working on that you'd like to share with us?
Well, we're always cataloging new material. One thing we haven't talked about is a big part of our business, which isn't printed books, but medieval manuscripts. So not things that were produced by the printing press in multiple copies, but were handwritten by
Wow.
medieval scribes, and therefore all of them are unique. So my colleague Sienna Wells, who specializes in medieval manuscripts for us, she's just published um, this publication, which
Wow.
came out a couple of weeks ago, called Saints and Sinners, where we explore the encounters between good and evil in medieval manuscripts. So you've got St. Michael slaying the devil there, you've got beautiful medieval paintings of the Last Supper. And so many other different wonderful and interesting things. And I mean, those are extraordinary objects to behold, where you can see six, 700 year gold glimmering off the
Wow.
page back at you. It's an incredible experience. Um, so yes, we're always publishing catalogs. We've got another catalog of J.R.R. Tolkien's work that is currently in progress, and the catalog after that will be on the history of the Bayeux Tapestry ahead of it coming to the UK next year.
Do you deal with, so in the rare medieval manuscripts, do you deal directly with, say, book restorers who are trying to improve the quality of the books in question?
We don't particularly. I'm really passionate about the integrity of these things as historical objects. So wherever possible, I want to leave them as they are when they come to me and not make a mark on them. Um, One of the things about what I was talking about earlier with the condition of books that's really important is that you have that historical integrity and originality to it. And when you start restoring a book, if you're adding new material to it, new bits of paper, new bits of leather, coloring it in to match, that to me dilutes the historical integrity of it as an object. So we want our marks to be left on these things as little as possible and kind of pass them on to their new owners as they are. It's a bit of a sort of ship of Theseus problem where, if you start taking these books apart and adding new things to them, are they still really that original
Right.
integral historical object?
Amazing. After we finish this interview and I get a quick lunch, I'm actually going to visit, and this wasn't by design, it just the gods of books decided on it. The place, the antiquarian bookseller where my family got me those two Orwell books that I'm going to meet her at around probably 1:30, so in about an hour from now. I would love to connect you two together because she has, and I don't know if this is of interest to you, but I think you mentioned earlier Virginia Woolf. She has one of the biggest collections of Virginia Woolf, books and memorabilia and so on. So maybe it might be a good thing for you to know of one another. How does that sound?
And yeah, no, that sounds marvelous. Thank you very much.
And if I do uncover some unbelievable book that I purchased, I will be the first to email you and tell you with glee that I just got a new book. Tom, I have to say, one of the greatest pleasures in terms of hosting someone on my show. Your passion comes out of every one of your pores. Thank you for all the wonderful stuff that you do. And please come back when your book comes out in 2027. Thank you so much, Tom. Stay on the line so we can say goodbye offline. Cheers.